You're listening to The White Rabbit, conversations on the art of presenting in a rather noisy world. Your hosts are Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. Matt helps leaders of international companies speak, write, and present with confidence. Alper is a communications trainer and a startup investor with a diverse portfolio of companies in Barcelona. If you like this podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. Now, on to Matt and Alper for today's conversation.
Alper, before we get into the subject for today's podcast, if you don't mind, I would like to take a moment of silence just because, we're both connected with Turkey. I live in Turkey, you're from Turkey, and so I would like to take a moment of silence for the people that were hurt in the earthquake. Is that okay?
I would like that too, yes.
Okay. So yeah, let's have our moment of silence now. Okay, so I'm going to switch into podcast mode now. Are you ready?
Okay. Yes.
So a couple weeks ago, we were talking about something. I think it was we were talking about the Q&A slide. And I made a suggestion. Instead of saving up audience questions for the end, distribute the audience questions throughout the presentation. And that'll make the presentation more
Yes, I like that.
Yeah, that'll make the presentation more of a two-way conversation, and you'll avoid this awkward silence at the end where, you ask for questions and then everybody has questions, but everybody's silent and it's awkward. And so when I make this suggestion, clients often ask me, well, that's a great idea, but how do I do that? And it's not easy because people have been trained. They've been to 1,000 presentations where the Q&A is saved up for the end, and so people are trained to hold on to your questions until the person is done speaking, and then you can either dump all your questions at the end, or you can just sit through the awkward silence. And so, and so clients ask me, well, your suggestion to distribute questions throughout the presentation is good, but how do I do it? How do I overcome this training that people have? And so I'm going to tell you what piece of advice I give, and then you give me some feedback on whether you think it's good advice, because I want to know, am I telling people the right thing, or am I giving people bad advice? So you give me some feedback on that, okay?
I'll do my best to be as unbiased as possible. That sounds good.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so what I tell people in order to distribute questions throughout the presentation is you've got to seed the questions throughout the presentations. You've got to distribute the questions. When I say the word seed, it's like seed as in, plant a seed, SEED, not seed defeat, not CEDE. So you've got to plant a seed. You've got to seed the questions throughout the presentation. And one way that you can do that is, while you're making your presentation, go around to some of the people who are going to be in your presentation. And often, if you're making a presentation for work, the people who are going to be in your presentation in the audience are probably going to be like, nearby. They're going to have an office nearby, so they'll be close by. So go to some of the audience members before the presentation and just tell them what you're going to say. All you need to do is, take an outline into the office with you. Tell them what you're going to say. Give them a preview of the outline of the presentation. See what questions they ask. And when they ask a question that you would like them to ask in the presentation, just say, that's a great question. Can you ask me exactly that in the presentation? And so you will know that on slide 3, for example, on slide 3, George is going to ask a question about ABC. And since you've had a preview into the question, you have a chance to prepare ahead of time how you're going to do the answer. And then you find three other people or two other people who will do that. You give them a preview of what you're going to say, and then they ask a question. You just say to them, "That's a great question. Can you ask me that question during the presentation?" And so now your audience, let's say that you've got an audience of 10 people or 20 people or 50 people or 1,000 people, whatever. And your audience now sees a few people asking questions. Somebody asks a question on slide 3, somebody asks a question on slide 5, somebody asks a question on slide 7. They know that it's okay and expected that whenever you have a question, just raise your hand or speak up. So that's the piece of advice that I give to people, is that in order to overcome this training that your audience probably has, that you've got to save up your questions for the end. Basically, just kind of handpick about 3 or 4 people who are basically going to demonstrate. They might not know that they're doing it. All they're doing is thinking, okay, I got a question about the subject, and now this guy is talking about the subject. I should ask my question. But the audience sees that it's okay to raise your hand or just speak up and ask your question during the presentation. And of the people that I give this to, of the people that I give this advice to, I would say that probably about 70% of the people say, this sounds like great advice. I'm going to do exactly this. But I get pushback from about 30% of the people. About 30% of the people, they'll say, this feels dishonest. And they're thinking, what they seem to be thinking is that when I walk into the room to give my presentation, if I know that on slide 3, George is going to ask me question XYZ, and I'm going to say ABC in response, if I know that when I walk into the room, that's dishonest. And I don't want to feel like a liar. I don't want to feel like I'm being dishonest. So I'm not going to do that. So about 70% of the people, they go along with this advice. They think it's great. But 30% push back and say, no, this technique feels dishonest. So I want to ask your opinion.
Okay.
Do you think, in your opinion, am I giving good advice or is this bad advice?
I'm going to start from the last, and I'll make a comment about the 30% who may think that this would be dishonest.
Okay.
I can identify with the reasoning behind why they might feel this to be dishonest.
Okay.
But I don't think it would be a deal breaker. I don't think it would be like scamming the audience or lying to them. I think the whole thing about seeding the questions is to make the presentation more conducive towards understanding, right? To make people be able to understand it better.
Yeah.
So as long as you're not dispensing wrong information with which would be through bad intentions, I don't think honesty should be questioned. But I can definitely understand the sentiment behind feeling that way.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I also want to ask you, this is a situation where you know that you will have some of the audience members before. So they will be people who you know.
Yes.
So you will be able to interact with them before the presentation, and you will plant them, so to speak, into the presentation, and on cue, they will ask the questions that you want them to ask.
Yeah.
What about, do I understand it correctly, by the way?
Yeah, you do. That, for example, that George in the audience is going to ask a question on slide 3. George is not sitting there thinking, I am a participant in this presentation. My job is on slide 3 to ask a question. It's just that George has a question.
Yes.
But still,
okay,
he is basically planted. So yeah, I am giving people advice to plant questions into the audience.
Okay. What about in situations where you will not know people beforehand? You will not get them to ask questions in a predetermined way. What is your take on, for example, you're delivering a presentation to a group of people for the first time. They will have questions. What is your advice on waiting till the last or seating them throughout the presentation the way that you just described?
In a case like that, the suggestion that I make is it's basically the same, except it's sped up. As I tend to tell people, okay, before your presentation, there's probably a coffee break or something. During the coffee break, talk to a handful of people, or maybe like just in the couple minutes before the presentation, because all you need is 2 or 3 people to demonstrate this question asking style. So go up to a couple people in the moments before the presentation, tell them what you'll be talking about, and see what kind of questions they ask. All you have to do is say, I'm going to be talking about XYZ. What would you like to know about XYZ? And then during your presentation, you can kind of point to that person. You could be talking blah, 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 blah. Daria, you have a question about subject ABC. Is that correct? Okay, so let's talk about ABC, because your question is blah, 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 right? And so now the audience sees that you have kind of a two-way conversation going with Daria. So it might not be as intentionally planted as if you have more time to prepare, like if you have a 24-hour cycle to prepare, but you're still basically beginning the presentation, kind of anticipating the first couple questions that people are going to have on their minds. And you're using a couple people in the audience to demonstrate that two-way conversation. So that's how I would handle that situation.
I like that. And I liked how it would allow the rest of the audience members to see that it's okay to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
They don't maybe have to wait for the end of the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And it usually takes, even in the beginning of the Q&A, if you have a separate one towards the end, it's interesting how it usually takes 1 or 2 people to break the silence, to ask the first couple of questions. And then you have a rush of questions coming in your way.
Yeah,
So
there's
to take that away from a specific moment all the way to the end of the presentation and distribute it throughout the entire speech, I think that's great advice. And I would definitely encourage that.
Okay, cool. All right, so we're about out of time. And so I will talk to you again next week then.
Okay, sounds good. I'll talk to you.
All right, thanks, Alper. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to The White Rabbit with Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or through your favorite feed.